This is the Impunity Observer podcast. Fergus Hodgson, your host. Thanks for being with us this week. I am I'm delighted to have one of my intellectual heroes, Marco Navarro-Génie, or Marco, and he has published, or he has many, let's say, elements to his name. He's a doctorate in political science from the University of Calgary, and his books are Canada's COVID, co-authored with Barry Cooper, biography of Augusto César Sandino, prophet of light, or Messiah of light and truth. He's also president of his own organization, the Haultain Research Institute. And what brought him to my attention lately, though, was his essay regarding Gustavo Gutierrez and liberation theology in Latin America. And he's uniquely positioned to speak about this, studying it through his graduate era, and also then, of course, writing the biography of Sandino. So, Marco, I admire you a great deal, and I'm really pleased to talk about this with you. Do you want to tell us how much of an impact did liberation theology, for people who don't know, this is a school of thought in Catholicism, actually change the course of history or just tap into the sentiments that were already there? How much do you think it actually was an impactful line of thinking?
Excellent question. Thank you, Fergus, for having me here. I'm always happy to chat with you. And this is a kind of an unexplored topic by and large, and kind of niche in some ways,
Yes.
but interesting nonetheless, because as people see the world theologically, they also interpret the world politically. And this is one of the reasons why I've worked on this. Liberation theology has had a pretty significant impact in the life of Latin American politics. And so there are two aspects to it. There's Latin America in general, and then there is Latin America as sort of a Catholic place in the world, and the impact that it has had on Catholicism. So this starts, of course, in the mid to late 1960s, and it still has reverberations to today. But to put it in a nutshell, this is a theology that is somewhat grafted onto Marxist analysis, and has become, in some respects, also grafted onto the ideas of some revolutionary movements in Latin America. Liberation theology, to put a finer point to you, answering your question, had an impact in Nicaragua, and had an impact in Haiti. Those are the two places where people who embraced these ideas rose to power and ran their societies.
Yes, and so, folks, if you want, we'll link to the article. It's called "The Legacy of Gustavo Gutierrez: colon Liberation Theology." And what sparked Marco to write this was the passing away of this Catholic priest, Gustavo Gutierrez, who I guess he 96 years old, around that. Yeah, so a man who lived a long time and back in 1971 published A Theology of Liberation. And I was not aware of the Haiti connection, but basically, while this school of thought, which emphasizes, you might say, social justice or some sort of economic redistribution and preferential treatment for the poor, has influenced many movements, a couple explicitly said, we rest on this, or we support this. And I was not aware of the Haiti connection. And that you describe how a literal Catholic priest got into the presidency. Is that correct?
Yes, Father Aristide became the president of Haiti, and of course, everything that one would have hoped and dreaded to happen happened. That things would start with, the caring and the compassion that you normally would associate a Catholic priest with, and then would unfold and develop into a kind of dictatorship that you would expect from people who are in power in an authoritarian society.
In the case of Nicaragua, it lasted what, just a couple of years before they just dispensed with any connection or respect for Catholicism? How long did that take?
It lasted the better part of a decade, before the Sandinistas came to power and a little bit after. The Minister of Education, the Minister of Culture, the Minister of Foreign Affairs were all serving Catholic priests. Depending on the age of your audience, some people might remember that when John Paul II, the then Pope from Poland, came to Nicaragua, he was greeted at the bottom of the steps on the plane by a couple of these priests, and the Pope literally wagged their fingers at them.
Wagged
And
his finger.
yes, and told them that uh, they would either keep their posts in government or that they would be defrocked, kicked out of the church, basically, because the influence of these priests, of course, helped to legitimize what essentially was a communist government.
Yeah. And let's just go through a few of these elements. Now, you list, I think, here 5 elements of this school of thinking or school of thought. And how much of this comes directly from Gutierrez, or you've distilled it from a bunch of different thinkers?
No, this is straight out of the Theology of Liberation, the book
Yeah.
published, as you pointed out, in the early 70s.
Yeah, so a preferential option for the poor, social and economic liberation, political action as an element of faith or expression of faith, solidarity with the oppressed, and then some kind of liberating praxis, which seems a bit more confusing. But basically, it's taking Christian or Catholic theology and really going beyond just moral questions into real economic judgment. And was this unique at the time?
Very much so. Look, before this stuff breaks into the open in the late 60s and early 70s, Catholic theology is bent um, eyes forward towards the eternal. And this is also part of the Enlightenment, in which we establish a separation between church and state, and it's got biblical references, right? When Jesus gets shown the famous coin with Caesar, and Jesus says, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's, and my kingdom is not on this of this world." So there was a clearly established division between the secular realm and religion and things eternal. What Gutierrez does is he sets that on its head and says the God of the Bible is also the God of Exodus. And in Exodus, God takes part in what essentially is the political liberation of his people when he takes them out of the slavery in Egypt. And so that's the framework of liberation theology. Is not the story of Christ. So liberation theology is less Christian and more Judaic in some sense, because the framing story is the story of political liberation as opposed to the spiritual liberation that Christ offers.
Sometimes it seems like Catholicism is almost an afterthought within this school of thought, because what I mean is that, of course, the Catholic Church is one of the most influential institutions on the planet, with an enormous, let's say, uh, number of adherents, a great deal of leadership. So anybody who wants to have influence is going to be attracted to that, whether he believes in the actual underlying tenets or not. And that's sometimes I get confused by this, because you mention how Papa Francisco or Pope Francis has come into the fray also, because some people scratch their heads and think, is this man a socialist or a Catholic? And there's this joke, is the Pope Catholic? Right. So it does seem like a question of priorities almost, or emphasis, as opposed to outright theological conflict, and that some people just have a great deal of focus on these economic and policy topics as opposed to the spiritual life. So how much were these people, let's say this Gutierrez, how much was he motivated by Christianity, or just, let's say, Marxist proclivities in economics?
He was first and foremost a Catholic priest, so his Christianity was at the forefront of things, but it was heavily steeped in Marxist rhetoric and in a Marxist framework of us versus them, the poor versus the rich, and so forth. And it's perfectly fine to say that you have a preferential option for the poor, because Christians want to help the poor. But when the rubber hits the road, that concept in politics opens up basically a class struggle. In the history of Exodus, the Jews leave Egypt without blood on their hands, right? Should God does his thing on
On
the
the way.
firstborn, right? But those are God's hands. The blood is on God's hands, not on the people of Israel. And so what Gutierrez failed to reconcile is that when you encourage that kind of conflict, people pick up arms and wage a kind of war or a civil war, like in Nicaragua and like in Haiti. And now these people have blood in their hands. They have murdered their brothers and sisters. And in the Catholic Church, for example, you probably know this, that all sins are forgivable, and you can become a priest if you have if you violated every single one of the commandments except for murder. If you have blood on your hands, you can never become a priest. So once you are a priest and you develop this system in which you indirectly have blood on your hands, you have to ask yourself the question. And the other thing is, Marxists are fairly good at developing this idea that you can kill all the bad guys and then everything is going to be all right. But in the theology of the Catholic Church, once you have murdered someone, you change, and those sins can be forgiven here, but it's not something that you just casually go about the rest of your life after you have murdered other people, which is what these sort of revolutionary ideas encourage, and that is completely incompatible with the Catholic faith.
That apologism for, let's say, just vigilante murder has risen its head with the medical insurance chief executive killed in New York, where I'm shocked at how many people basically sided with this young man who committed the crime. And apparently he has all sorts of female admirers going to the courtroom even. So there is this weird admiration for this retribution. Yeah.
Compare that to the fellow who got killed in the hands of the police and sparked the whole Black Lives Matter thing.
I can't keep track. There have been a few of them, but what you mean the first one?
Ferg, what was his name? I forget his name.
Ferguson, where is this place in Missouri, or where is the one up in Minneapolis? Which
In
one?
Minneapolis, yes, the one in Minneapolis, right? One person, right? And look at what happened, right? The international condemnation, Canadians, Europeans, everybody was sort of screaming bloody blue murder to all police the world over, right? And here we got somebody who kills one individual, just one, right? And all of a sudden there's this huge celebration and admiration. That says absolutely nothing about the way we view life. It says more about the political ideologies that motivate these sentiments, right? In one, it's okay to kill, and in the other one, oh my God, you killed one person. The world should come to an end.
Let me just give a little bit of a personal anecdote here. As you might know, I've been to many Spanish language masses over the years. And I hate to say this, but there actually is a little bit of a different slant or theme to it. That's just my perception. That especially because we have many Spanish language masses here in the United States, and there'll be a little bit of a different feel to the homilies, right, or the presentations. And often I feel as though this liberation theology, I mean, not literally, but it seems to live on. That it seems to have really taken a hold. But obviously, this man was born in Peru, so he was Latin American. Naturally, that would be the Spanish language world would be where his views are most readily received. How influential is it today?
I have this. I don't know if you're going to be able to see this.
Yes.
Um,
Oh, a Black theology of liberation. Yeah. Yeah.
So it has spun into there is now women's theology of liberation, there is Black people's theology of liberation, and so it's really has become a force that moves underneath the currents of all this DEI stuff, and people won't readily acknowledge that it is so, but that's exactly the set of ideas that moves right underneath this. It's basically a different spin on the preferential option for the poor.
Yeah. And you note here about Pope Francis. that his quote, his papacy has been defined by economic inequality, migration, and environmental justice. And the last one makes me cringe a little bit. All areas of concern in liberation theology, albeit through a lesser Marxist approach. So it seems like Pope Francis is almost the embodiment of, let's say, a little bit of a refined or liberation theology 2.0 that's acceptable within the Catholic framework, maybe.
In many ways, Pope Francis is the first woke pope.
Yeah, yeah.
He's green to the core, and he has embraced almost every possible woke, left-leaning, and social Marxist cause that there is. And that doesn't make him less Catholic, in my view, but it certainly places him in a different political light.
And this man obviously he was no slouch intellectually. He was a thoughtful man. And so born in Lima, Peru, but studied, I think, in Germany, all over the place. He really got around. And given his international, let's say, voyages, were there, aside from what we know best, let's say the United States and Canada, but were there offshoots in other groups around the world?
Oh yeah, sure. Um, for example, there is a set, the Buff brothers, in Peru. So excuse me, in Brazil,
Okay.
where also one of whom was a Catholic priest, who embraced these ideas. They popped up just about everywhere. And that said, Gutierrez, his last job was teaching in the Faculty of Theology at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, the largest Catholic university on the planet. He was not a marginal figure at all, but quite influential outside the sphere of Latin American politics.
That is a relevant point because Notre Dame would probably, to the normies or to the people out there who are not really deep in the Catholic Church, they would see it as one of the figurehead institutions in the United States, even though it's not, in my opinion. But it's one of those institutions that sort of keeps itself in both camps a little bit, keeps itself acceptable to the intellectual classes or the academic classes, but also is still quasi-Catholic. So it is an influential post. And there have been a few prominent critics. Now, was it Novak? I'm not sure who Michael Novak,
Yes, Michael
Cardinal
Novak.
Ratzinger, yes, who have gone against this. Now, what about is it the Acton Institute, the organization in Michigan that is a big, let's say, Catholic promoter of free market ideas? Are they almost just like the mirror image of liberation theology?
In many respects, yes, they are faithful Catholics, and there are many of them, and I know a couple of them. They're sacramental Catholics. One of my friends who works there comes from Argentina, so he's intimately acquainted not just with the ideas of liberation theology, but with the life and times of Pope Francis. And they emphasize, to be sure, the communitarian aspect of religion and Catholicism, but also the primacy of the individual, and the freedom that the market system affords to the development of the individual and uh, social collectivities, nations, communities, countries. Right?
Are organizations like the Acton Institute then more reactionary, basically playing defense against these, let's say, Marxist ideas? Because my personal view is that one of the fundamental problems is just that the ideas of Marxist or leftist economics are counterproductive. That you're not actually helping the poor, even if you feel like you are. So it's almost like a lack of economics education that is creating this problem.
In the times in which we live, to oppose the social Marxist structures that surround us is to be reactionary. They would consider me a reactionary. They would consider you a reactionary. I would submit. So we're not alone. But the thing is, they have moved the ideological ball so far to the left that people who are, generally speaking, moderate, never mind on the right, are now painted as extreme right or far right. And it's not a coincidence, right, that we hear more and more this terminology of far right and extreme right. But the people who they consider to be on the extreme right are only on the extreme right the extent to which they have traveled so far out to the left that they have become essential leftist radicals.
One other observation, I mentioned the Spanish language churches here in the United States, but it's not just them actually. There's been a fragmentation of Catholic practice in the United States. Where I live in Colorado, there's one church I know that's exclusively a Latin mass offering. And then during the COVID era, which of course relates, you wrote a lengthy book on this, Canada's COVID, there's been this almost like a division of some churches that want to enforce all sorts of mask mandates or state, you don't go to church because you don't want to spread the germs or whatever. And then others that defy this. And it's just been this weird sorting of the church, like I said, a fragmentation. And I don't know how much of this rests on liberation theology, but it certainly seems related that some people are more, let's say, want an interventionist or progressive state, and others want a more decentralized and independent church that's basically a defense mechanism against the state.
One's reactions towards COVID, um, more than anything else, religion, education, and what have you, had something to do with one's left wing or right wing proclivities to some extent, even though they almost ended up in the opposite camp. But inside the Catholic Church, it was certainly the case. I have had the same observations regarding the traditional Latin Mass communities. And of course, there is a kind of a mini war inside the Catholic Church against traditional Catholics. The previous Pope, Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict XVI, the principal foe of liberation theology inside the Catholic Church and around the world, I would submit, became Pope, and he celebrated and brought back the Latin Rite Mass in a document, in an official document of the Church. Pope Francis has now repudiated that document, and in some places has given the local bishops the authority to repudiate and even persecute Latin Mass communities. I submit to you that you look up the Bishop of Texas, who basically balked at one of the bishops of Texas. His name just escapes me. Balked at the whole idea, and he was sidelined. He has been sidelined because he basically refused to go along with the political aspects of all this sort of nearly um, chasing after and trying to chase out basically traditional Catholics uh, from the mainstream church, which is nonsense.
Yeah, we have one here just in the north of Fort Collins, and it's foundation, is it Society of Pious? I don't want to misstate it, but
The
there's
Society of
one that
Pius the
is,
12th.
they've had a fraught relationship with the Vatican.
Yeah, going back to John Paul II, who, by the way, excommunicated their founder. But there is another branch of them. They're called the Priestly Society of St. Peter's, who was founded after with the endorsement of the Polish Pope and then Cardinal Ratzinger, and they have also been on the crosshairs of present day Vatican.
Uh, Maybe another organization you're familiar with, informal, called the St. Gallen Mafia. Are you familiar with this?
No, no.
Okay, you need to look this one up, Marco. But basically, a group of liberation theology or leftist inclined priests, bishops, leadership of the church have been meeting in St. Gallen, Switzerland for years to basically plot. And it sounds like a bad novel, but it's true. Anyway, but let's get back to Latin America though, because I want to try and come to some kind of conclusion here. It is the case that Catholicism still has a strong presence in Latin America. I mean, everyone knows this, and they have so many beautiful churches and traditions. Does liberation theology still need to be combated, or is it something that people who want the rule of law and economic development can live with?
It depends on where you are. In some places, the church is still kind of manipulated in some ways, and in some places not. But the balance of it is this: we're in 2025, so 100 years after the Mexican revolutionaries were going full tilt against the church, shooting priests and nuns indiscriminately on the streets of every town and city in Mexico. You know, they massacred them. There was a rebellion, the famous Cristero Rebellion. It was the Mexican peasants who rebelled against the Mexican revolutionaries. And so this is a minor sort of version of that story in many different ways. But my point is this: there have been many attempts in the life of the Catholic Church when secular governments, you can start perhaps with the French revolutionaries in 1789, who have gone after the church and tried to completely crush it. And that has yet to succeed. Um, Conversely, there have been many attempts at replacing the Catholic Church as a sort of main cultural staple of belief. Communists and many other
Of
kinds of
course.
revolutionaries,
Yes. Yeah.
and yet not a single one of those attempts at replacing and extracting Catholicism from these societies and replacing it, the replacements have never yielded anything better, but the opposite. The wonderful thing, perhaps, about the Roman Catholic religion is that it tends to thrive in the context of adversity. Nothing does wonders for the church than when it's being persecuted.
It is an irony. Yeah. So we've been speaking with Marco Navarro-Génie, or Marco, and he is an intellectual up in Canada, in Alberta. And obviously, I've been following his work for many years. His Substack is amazing. It's the Haultain Research Institute. And then he has a special one devoted to Latin America. Oh, we'll have this, we'll have it in the show notes. Also, his book, for those who want to really have a bit more, let's say, have a richer understanding of history and the thinking that has gone behind many of these socialist revolutions. His book on Sandinismo, or the life, the intellectual life of Augusto César Sandino, is named Augusto César Sandino, Messiah of Light and Truth. It's a wonderful book, easy to read, easy to understand, and I will have a link to that. I've also reviewed that book. So I think it's, like I said, I encourage people to read the full essay by Marco, The Legacy of Gustavo Gutierrez, Liberation Theology, and to follow your work. You're on X. I mean, you're on all sorts of platforms, but Substack is great. That's where I get a lot of your work. So otherwise, Marco, I look forward to next time, and I appreciate the depth that went into this essay. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure.